Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
Hi everyone, I'm Lamia H. I'm the special guest for this podcast today, and my pronouns are she and they.
In this episode, we'll discuss Malala Yousafzai and more young people in seemingly impossible situations saving lives. Our biblical hero in the Bible is Esther today, and she doesn't really come up in the lectionary except as an alternate reading for Proper 21 or Lectionary 26, which falls on September 29th in 2024. We do have two content notifications for this episode. We mention human trafficking when talking about Esther and gun violence when talking about Malala Yousafzai.
We'd also like to invite you to become a Patreon supporter for more content at patreon.com/nerdsthatchurch, and check out the episode description for links to any references we will make in this episode. There will be a lot of them.
As we dive into Malala and more in our theme of young people saving lives this week, we are super excited to have special guest Lamia H. Lamia is a former Lambda Literary Fellow whose writing has appeared in Vice, Salon, Vox, Autostraddle, and others. Their memoir, Hijab Butch Blues, was awarded a Stonewall Book Award and the Brooklyn Public Library Book Prize. She currently lives in New York with her partner. Welcome!
We are so glad to have you.
Yes.
Thank you for having me on here.
Yeah.
And our overall theme for this episode is young women in apparently impossible situations saving lives. There are a lot of them.
It's true. It was hard to find just enough.
Yeah. Narrowing it down was a problem.
Yeah. Indeed. Kamala Khan is our first pop culture superhero, and she's also known as Ms. Marvel. She is the current iteration of Ms. Marvel and shows up in comic books, on Disney+. She has a TV show and in the Marvels movie. Kamala is a Pakistani-American Muslim. She's 16 years old and lives in Jersey City with her family. She loves Captain Marvel, who is a real person in her universe, and then magically gets the embiggening power. She gets it through a complicated thing in the comics. In the show, she gets it through a charm that has been passed down from her grandmother. And her powers take off more in the comics when she stops actually trying to look like the original Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, who is skinny, white, and blonde. Her healing actually doesn't work until she's like, oh, maybe if I am myself. And then it starts to work, which I think is great. Yeah, she has a secret identity. For the most part, there are a couple people that know, but most people don't know who she is. And she is eager to do good. She has a strong heart and values. Her mom figures out what's going on before she tells her. And part of the history of Ms. Marvel as a whole is that she first appeared as Carol Danvers in 1968 as a counterpart to Marvel, or Captain Marvel. And though Danvers then took on the title of Captain Marvel, Kamala Khan is the fourth incarnation. So then there were others. And she first appeared in 2013. And Kamala Khan in the comics was created by Sana Amanat, G. Willow Wilson, and Adrian Alfona. And she is the first Muslim character to headline her own comic book for Marvel, which is a really big deal.
Yeah.
And she is currently played by Iman Vellani, who was a Kamala Khan Ms. Marvel fan before actually trying out and getting the part to play her in the TV show and then also in the movies, which is really cool. I love when that happens.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Can I add something totally nerdy here?
Yes.
I actually don't read comics a ton. I just didn't grow up with them, and they just weren't part of my childhood. But I remember when this was first announced, and I think it was in the early 2010s, and having just my mind be blown by this, that there could be a Miss Marvel that that felt so accessible and had so many identities that I grew up around. And the best part was that my cousins, who were 5 and 7 at that time, just lost their
Yes.
They called me up and they were like, hey, do you know this is a thing? Are you into superheroes? And I'm not really into superheroes, but they were 5 and 7 and they were just so excited. And that is my absolute favorite thing about Miss Marvel, is how excited my cousins were.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing that Ms. Marvel is now known for is that she is Muslim, that she is a teenager in Jersey City, with all that entails. And that's why I first read any comics of hers, was because of that. Because I was like, what? We finally have someone who is not just like thin white blonde stereotype, thin white brunette stereotype, thin white blonde stereotype. And that's how I got into her in comics, because I grew up kind of superhero adjacent, but I didn't grow up like collecting comics and stuff. And so she was one of the first comic books I ever bought.
Yeah. Comics are expensive. That's why I didn't really grow up with them either. But
Yeah. For me, I just like love the reframing of like of difference as a superpower, and you know, I think about that a lot in terms of queerness and the way that queerness can become a superpower or a miracle. And yeah, I love turning the like Muslimness on its head. I love turning the sort of like immigrant teenager on its head and like turning that into a superpower.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. And that just like moved us naturally into the what we love about them question. But yeah, I also love that. And in a later episode, we'll be diving into diversity as a superpower kind of stuff, particularly with our episode on the X-Men and disability rights. So I'm excited. If you are interested in that, then tune in to our episode in a few weeks on that as well. But I do love that, the flipping upside down. And I love that the comics actually deal with reality, right? Like the police presence and the way that the police and the federal investigators or whatever are navigating both well and terribly what it means to be investigating a particularly Muslim community and what might be going on. Like all of the stuff that has been built up in this country, particularly since 9/11, around Islamophobia and all of that stuff that goes into highly suspect superhero who's like doing good, and they're like, we have to investigate. And how do you investigate, and what does it mean to try and investigate in a sacred space? Because you shouldn't. And because we have like very clear values and norms around not doing that, which is how we get sanctuary communities where people who are undocumented immigrants can be protected. Yeah, so that's another piece of this that I think is part of the taking reality and turning it on its head, where we're not just pretending it doesn't exist. We're not creating an alternate universe where Islamophobia doesn't exist. We're saying that it exists, and that is also something she has to wrestle with, because that is the reality that Muslims have to wrestle with in our country and in the world all the time. Yeah, so I like that aspect because I think it's done and done well, but not overly done that it's just gonna be re-traumatizing the whole time.
She gets to be a person.
Yeah.
It's not all about that. She gets to be a person. And so I've read the first few of her comics a while back. I really loved them. They were great. And I love that, speaking of her getting to be a person, she gets to be a teenager. Of course a teenager would come up with the word embiggen. That's wonderful. I love that. And I also love in the comics, she has a teacher at her mosque. It has been a minute since I've read them, so I think it might be her imam, but it might also just be like the imam's assistant or something. But there's this guy who's from her mosque who is like the main religious authority figure in her life. And he is portrayed as, frankly, a bit of a boring stick in the mud in the comics. Like, he is constantly showing up to, you know, say the serious thing and that kind of thing. But also, it is very consistent that he genuinely cares very deeply about her and her family and their well-being. And so it's a nice but nuanced reading of his character.
Yeah, I like that too. And it comes out in the TV show too, where they're like talking while he's trying to teach, and he's like, Ms. Khan, can I help you? He doesn't do it exactly like that, but it's just like an interesting play.
Yeah, what I really like about her is, playing off this whole teenager thing, is that she's also just a teenager, in that she, you know, has her moments of like being frustrated with the world or with her parents, you know, makes like impetuous decisions. And yeah, I have a huge soft spot in my heart for complicated figures, especially complicated women and girls, which I think is something that we don't get to see a lot of on TV. You know, girls and women sort of like raging or just like being wrong and like being hot-headed or just, So I really also like that about her, is that she's, you know, sometimes wrong.
Yeah, Yeah, especially like her initial introductory arc, right? There's some things and some assumptions and some like caught up in teen angst and teen crushes that impact what she does and how that plays out in fun and not so fun for her ways, which, yeah, I just love that. Yeah. And then our other question is, how do they tie into the day's themes? So when we think about Kamala Khan and the ways that, especially as a young person in scary situations, obviously there's like, she's a superhero and that involves risking life to save life, but also just all of the things that she is navigating, as we've talked about, like being a teenager, having superpowers, being Muslim in a country that is full of Islamophobia. All of those can feel like impossible situations. And nevertheless, she keeps on saving lives, and she keeps on being her delightful and awkward and nerdy self, which is a great, I love that part, that it's, okay, how do we continue to be ourselves and also save lives, you know, and keep it a secret from family for as long as she can, which is not particularly long, but yeah.
Well, and can I just say, let's all be grateful that no one gave me superpowers when I was going through puberty, because there were enough explosions as it was, so we did not need to add more.
Yeah. I have no idea what I would have been like. It probably would not have been spectacular, but...
I think I would have taken them. I would have been like, all right, the thing that I remember the most about being a teenager is this like deep feeling of existential boredom. And I think it would have helped with that.
Yeah, sure. I could see that. Yeah. Yeah. I probably also would have taken them. I was trying to think of what I would do with them, but I grew up in the mountains. And so skiing and snowboarding, I think actually would have been I think I would have been better at it if I had the powers once I got a hold of them, but it would have been more fun to ski and snowboard down a mountain with like make my own jumps, and that would have been fun. The main places to check out more about Kamala Khan are her comic series, the Ms. Marvel comic series, and the Ms. Marvel show on Disney. It's a one-season show so far. And the newest movie is The Marvels. She also comes up in other areas in animated stuff, but those are the big ways to find out more about her.
And so our next heroes that we have for this episode, we have a pair, because we have one hero from the Bible and one from the Quran. And so our biblical hero for this episode is Esther. Esther, who we can also find in the Book of Esther, which, again, like some of our previous heroes, having a book named after them makes it very easy to find them when you open your Bible. But when we start the Book of Esther, we find that there is a young girl named Hadassah, but she is better known to us as Esther. I think that's just a language thing. Hadassah is her Hebrew name, and Esther is the name that she was known by in her home country. She was an orphan Jewish girl raised by her uncle and or cousin Mordecai. The relationship's a little fuzzy. And Mordecai's father had been taken in the Babylonian exile, and so Mordecai and Esther lived in the city of Susa, just north of what is now the Persian Gulf in Iran. And when she was a young girl, the king of her country deposed Queen Vashti, who we have previously talked about in our episode with Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. And so he had his military gather young women from the city, including Esther, so that he could choose a new queen, where they spent a year receiving cosmetic treatments. And then Esther also earned the favor of the person who was in charge of the young girls, and they helped her and coached her to gain the king's favor. And so when she was sent into the king's bedroom for a night, he was delighted with her, and so he immediately chose her to be the new queen. And soon after she became queen, Mordecai overheard two of the king's men planning to assassinate him, and he told Esther, who told the king what Mordecai had discovered, and the men were executed, and Mordecai's saving the king's life was recorded in the kingdom's records. This becomes important later. And then the king promoted a man named Haman to be his second in command, and commanded that all people should bow down to him. But Mordecai, being Jewish, refused to. And so when Haman learned of this, he was very angry, and he plotted to kill all the Jewish people in the king's lands. And so he told the king that they weren't following the king's laws and that he would take care of having them killed. And he paid the king a lot of money for the privilege of having them killed. And so the king consented. Presumably the money sounded like a good idea. And Mordecai heard about this and immediately went into mourning along with all of the Jewish people who heard about it. And he sent Esther a copy of the decree and asked her to plead with the king to save their people. But the king hadn't asked to see her for a month, and if she approached him without being called for, he could have her killed on a whim, and he actually often did that to people. And so Mordecai told her that she wouldn't be able to escape what Haman was planning, and that, to quote from the Book of Esther, "Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." And so Esther asked him to have all the Jews in Susa pray and fast for her. And after 3 days, she put on her royal robes and all her jewelry, and she approached the king, risking her life. But he spared her, and when he asked her what she wanted, she invited him and Haman to a couple of banquets, which he accepted, but he thought it was a strange thing for her to risk her life for. And so Haman left the first banquet happy and complained to his friends that the only problem that he really had in his life was Mordecai. And so his wife suggested that he have a gallows built that night and have the king hang Mordecai on it before the second banquet. And that night the king couldn't sleep, and so he had the kingdom's records read to him. I guess they must have been boring records. He was hoping they'd put him to sleep. And so he was reminded of Mordecai and that Mordecai had saved his life, and he apparently hadn't given any gifts to Mordecai in thanks for this. And so Haman came into the room to ask the king to execute Mordecai, but instead the king first asked him, "Say, Haman, what should the king do for a man he wishes to honor?" Now, Haman thought that the king meant himself, and so he suggested a whole bunch of, frankly, fairly ridiculous things that should be done for this man that the king wants to honor. And so the king said, "That all sounds great. You should do all that for Mordecai as a thank you for saving the king's life." And so Haman had to do all of those things for Mordecai and was pretty angry about it.
I love the poetic justice of that.
Yes,
I
that
just love
is
the
fabulous
poetic justice
timing.
of that. Of like, oh, I'm gonna get all this great stuff, and now I have to give it to the one person that I think is my like mortal enemy.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And so at the second banquet, which is in chapter 7 of the Book of Esther, the king asked again, what does Esther really want? And she explained that someone wanted to kill both her and all of her people. And when the king asked who that was, she said it was Haman. And the king was so angry that he left for a moment to calm down, and while he was gone, Haman begged Esther for his life because he knew bad things were about to happen. And he threw himself on her couch while he was begging, and just then, that was when the king walked back in, and he saw him there and accused Haman of assaulting the queen. And the servants restrained Haman, and one suggested that he could be hung on the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, and so they did that. And the king had Mordecai brought in, and Esther explained that this was the man who had raised her, and the king gave Mordecai Haman's old job of being in charge of everything, and Esther pleaded with the king, and the king not only undid the previous decree ordering the execution of all the Jewish people, but actually gave them permission to defend themselves from those who were a threat to them on that very same day that they were going to be executed, the 13th day of the 12th month. And he also said that they could take all of their wealth of those people who they killed. And so the Jewish people defended themselves on the 13th day, but they did not touch the wealth of those people that they killed. And then on the 14th and 15th day of that month, they rested and feasted, and they were then declared the holiday of Purim, the 14th and 15th day. And that remains to this day. And Esther and Mordecai, and presumably, I guess also the king, lived happily ever after.
The end.
Yes.
It is, an entire book of the Bible. So it is quite the story, but...
It's a slightly more complicated story than Ruth, yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Totally random aside, but I once went to a Purim where the reenactment had Esther as this genderqueer character, and it was so cool.
That would
just going to leave it at that.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That would be... I would love that.
Yeah.
Now I, have Esther blossoming in a whole new way in my head, and I love it. Nice. Yeah.
And our hero for the Quran this episode is Asya, and she was the wife of the pharaoh who ruled over Egypt. She became Moses' adoptive mother when she found him in the Nile, and as he grew up, she heard Moses and Aaron preach about God and secretly began to worship God herself. The Quran tells a brief version of the story of Moses in chapter 28, which is also known as the Surah Al-Qasas. And the Quran also includes her supplication to God in chapter 66, the Surah Al-Tarim, which is in verse 11, and the English translation from Wikipedia has that as, "My Lord, build for me a home with thee in the garden, and deliver me from Pharaoh and his work, and deliver me from evil-doing folk." And when she witnessed a Jewish woman tortured to death for her faith, she confessed her faith to her husband, and he had her tortured as well to try to get her to change her faith, but she did not. And she is respected as the second of the 4 greatest women in the history of Islam, and she will be one of the first women to enter paradise. And also, of course, our guest spoke about her at some length in her book, so would you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I have this chapter in my book in which I retell the story of Asiya. The way that I heard of the story growing up was that she was this, incredibly patient woman. She was really kind. She was just like, she had Moses sort of like saved when he was found sort of like floating in the river. She asked for him to be rescued and she kind of raised him as a son. And it's really interesting because as I grew older, I discovered and like understood a little bit more of the undercurrent behind the kindness and patience. What was sort of like unsaid when I was much younger was that her husband, the Pharaoh, was this, terrible, evil man who was like really abusive. He tortured her. He was really terrible to her. My mother would always invoke Asiya whenever she was like talking to people. I would overhear her talking to people and be like, be patient, like Asiya, like be patient with your husband. And so there's this way in which that story was sort of like ingrained in me as this like, positive thing. But then as an adult, I had to like sit back and be like, wait, this is terrible. She was in this like really violent situation and basically she's being used as a model of staying in that violent situation, which I found really hard. And for me, in writing my book, I wanted to give her a different ending. I really, really love this prayer that she does that you quoted, Kay. This, my Lord, build for me a home in, paradise. And so in my reimagined version of that story, she gets that home in this world as well. She sneaks away from the Pharaoh. She puts away a little bit of money for herself, which I think is also, a thing that I grew up with as a concept. If your husband is terrible, put away some money just in case you need it. And so in my mind, she does that. She saves up some money and she leaves. She leaves the Pharaoh. She leaves Egypt. She goes away to somewhere else and she gets that house with the garden in this life. She finds someone who is kind and tender to her, who, braids her hair and rubs her feet. And she finds a version of this thing that she prayed for, not just in paradise, but also in this life.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. I think part of what I really love about the way that you talk about Asiya in Hijab Butch Blues, Lamia, is you do tie it in, right? You tie it in with the very problematic encouraging people to stay in abusive situations and the very complicated reality of abusive situations. And you don't leave her there. And I think it is easy for us to leave particularly stories from our sacred texts, from our scriptures. It's easy for us to just leave them in those boxes, in those passages that we have written out, when the reality is that those passages were written in a particular way at a particular time and all of that stuff, and that there's more. When we think about a full life, you can never boil it all down, right? You can't ever contain all of it in one story or a certain number of passages. And so having that space to then say, but I dream for her another ending. And I dream this ending. In Judaism, right, we talk about that as midrash, the filling in the gaps in the story. And I don't know if there is an equivalent term or type of doing that's like official in Islam.
I wish Christianity
had
one.
But it feels like what you're doing. I really wish Christianity had one. But yeah, that like, let me dream for you another ending. And in that way also dreaming another ending for all of the people who have heard that story in a way that kept them in an abusive situation and kept them in danger.
Yeah, I love that there's a word for that in Judaism. I'm really obsessed with that, this idea of sort of like what is left unsaid and why it's left unsaid. I think about it a lot, especially in terms of people who are marginalized. And, you know, Asiya was super marginalized. Even in the Quran, it's really interesting. She's never actually named. She's always referred to as the Pharaoh's wife, or she's referred to with like pronouns like, you know, like she or her, like you, like that sort of thing. But what I find really intriguing is, yeah, just sort of like imagining her into being. And, you know, there's a particular reason why people are left out of stories: patriarchy, misogyny, and many others. And yeah, so to me, yeah, there's this idea of like what is left out of the archive, and how do we, if we can't have access to that, how do we imagine it? That's really important to me, especially thinking of people as sort of like complicated characters, thinking of people having sort of like full lives. Yeah, I love that there's a word for that.
Yeah.
The cats were napping very happily earlier, but Hobbs has decided to introduce himself to our guests again. He does love guest starring on the podcast also.
I was going to say, he's the most frequent guest star.
Yes, well, Calvin is here, but he's very happily asleep behind my head, so I doubt he'll introduce.
Yeah, we have a policy that any pets that are making noise, we gotta like say hi to them.
It would be rude to, you know, hear a cat and not know what their name is.
I definitely heard that meow and was like, cat or child? Cat or child?
Yep, cat.
But I also wanted to say that I really appreciate Asia's story because so many of us know someone who has been in that situation. When I was reading that chapter of your book, I was very much reminded of the story of one of my own grandmothers who was not physically abused but was in a bad marriage, and at one point one of her daughters asked her, "Why didn't you leave?" And her response was, "Where would I go?" Which is exactly the response that you've heard again and again in your book. Because my grandmother was never allowed to learn how to drive. She was never allowed to gain professional skills that she could get a job with. And
oh, wow.
So, yeah, so many of us know people and would love to reimagine a new ending for their lives.
I think it's also interesting. We paired these two because, honestly, I did a Google search of, like, Esther in the Quran. And Asiya is the one that came up. And they're very different characters. They're very different people. And also, there is this connection between the two of them in that neither of them really has much control over their lives. Right? We talk about Esther and we lift her up as this amazing character, but she has survived human trafficking, right? She was found by the king's forces and taken, and they did who knows what cosmetically to her to beautify her, to please the king. And the previous queen, when the king was sick of her, he just got rid of her, right? So it is not a physically abusive relationship. He is never physically abusive, but there is abuse in the amount of power he has over her. And that connection between Esther and Asiya is just really interesting because they both find ways to resist, to carve out their own, I am not going to be confined to these circumstances, right? And for Esther, she needs Mordecai, and Mordecai is the one who encourages her to that. And for Asiya, Musa, is the one who, like, helps give her that, helps pull her out of that, of, like, she is patient and kind the whole time. And then it's when she finds baby Musa that then she digs deeper into that. Then she starts to hear about a different faith and all of that. And so I didn't anticipate that, but now I'm like, oh, they like weave together really well.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So the Bible passage that we will link to for Esther is Esther chapter 7, which is only 10 verses long. And this is the part of the story where she tells the king that she's Jewish and Haman wants her and her people dead. And then Haman is taken to be executed. It's the climax of the story. It's the final upending of Haman's power. It's the great switcheroo, basically. And I love that passage for how dramatic it is. But, of course, I think we've already talked quite a bit about what do we love about these characters. They are wonderful. Esther was very much my childhood example of a teenager saving essentially the world. Like, she saved her own world. What was the world to her? And she was a girl, and back in the 90s, that was actually, like, still a big thing.
Yeah.
And I also remember reading a passage, I think in the book, The Five Books of Miriam, which is sort of a feminist reimagining of the first 5 books of the Bible from a Jewish perspective. And in there, a woman commented that before Esther goes in to see the king and asked him to come to the banquet, she gets dressed up. She puts on her royal robe. She puts on all her jewelry. She's probably sparkling like a star. And while I'm not personally big on jewelry or dressing up myself, the women in my family certainly believe in using every advantage you can get your hands on when it counts. And so I love that she does that.
Yeah, right. When you are in any situation, what can you do to make your situation go better? And I think, so Lamia, in this chapter in your book, you also talk about your own relationship to the United States, which is the country that we all are in right now. And I couldn't help, you don't necessarily explicitly phrase it this way, but it felt to me like you had to be Asia in this country in terms of immigration.
Yeah.
Right? There is the, like, where else would you go that your mentor points out of, like, you can't go to the place you grew up, you can't go to the place where you have citizenship. Like, those are not going to be places where you can live and thrive. And yet the United States has so many different hoops that you have to go through and over and over again, and you can't even go to an art museum, right, without being reminded of that otherness and the ways that you have been declared as not belonging by particular people and policies. And I'm curious how intentional that was, I guess. Like, it feels to me like the United States with a lot of people has a fairly abusive relationship. But I'm not sure if you've ever thought about it that way.
Yeah, it was definitely very, very intentional. Those were the parallels that I was trying to draw. And I'm so glad you caught them, because I don't know, I like wrestled with this book in terms of like, how explicit do I make things? Like, how do I sort of like show and not tell? So I'm really glad you caught that parallel, because I'm a big fan of sort of like trusting my reader. Yeah. So the reason that I wrote about this was because I really wanted to write about my experience with the immigration system in the US. And I, very recently got citizenship after being here for 21 years. And the entire process has honestly felt really terrible, from the sort of like having to prove yourself as, this like good immigrant, answering questions about, your ties to groups, and the ways in which like I've been so, scared to get arrested, or like scared to miss like a deadline, scared to miss a piece of mail that says that, they didn't receive X, Y, and Z, which is something that, actually did happen to me once, and just scared of feeling like my entire life and this entire life that I've built rests in the hands of this system that is frankly terrible to so many people. And I say this as someone who has had like a fairly privileged immigration experience. I came here as an undergrad, I came here for college, and so I've been on, student visas, various sort of like extensions to student visas, work visas, and then finally a green card. And, I recognize the immense sort of like privilege I've had, and also the sort of like the ways in which I have had people help me with forms, etc. But it's still, it's felt so heavy and like this big weight on me. And it's so interesting because even now that it's over, the sort of like trauma of it is so ingrained in me that I don't think some of that will ever go away. The fact that I can stay here, like just that'll never go away. And I think this is also like a thing that happens in abusive relationships, the sort of like post trauma, the sort of like not knowing like where would you go otherwise, what would you do, and the staying. And so and I say this as someone who has sort of like in the end like chosen to stay in the US, chosen to stay in this situation. But and so that's also why it was really important to me to imagine an alternate ending for Asia. I've also had cousins and friends in abusive relationships, and it was also important to me that they left. although I realize that not everyone has the ability to. But yeah, that was definitely something that was very intentional. And it was something that I wanted to write about because I feel like that's a thing that people don't hear about. I remember my first time reading of someone experiencing what it's like to go through like US customs and like through the border and just sort of arriving in the US and like, you know, going through immigration like passport control. I think I read that Riz Ahmed wrote about that maybe in like the early 2010s, and I just like remember reading about it and like having my mind blown because I had never read anyone write about this so viscerally, and so it was really important to me to write about it.
Yeah, I am so very glad that you did. And I will tell you what I told another friend when they became a citizen. Congratulations if that is what you want.
That's good.
I mean, he did it also during the former president, and so there's like that extra now you are a U.S. citizen with all that entails, and it's not always a congratulatory thing. Sometimes it is just a survival thing.
And so for media for the story of Esther, as we previously discussed in our episode with Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, we have Queen Vashti's Comfy Pants, which tells the backstory of what happens before Esther becomes the queen. And that is a delightful children's book. Everyone needs comfy pants, absolutely. And then for the story of Esther itself, there is a graphic novel by J.T. Waldman that retells her story called Megalat Esther. When you Google that, it's going to come up with a variety of options, so we will provide a specific link, but unfortunately I couldn't find it on Bookshop, so we're giving you an Amazon link. And the graphic novel is a fantastic retelling of her story. I loved it. I would definitely suggest it for older teens and up, because it does address the human trafficking, and it does a wonderful job. And then, of course, we are delighted to suggest Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H. for the story behind Asiya, and so many other stories
as well as a whole bunch of others. They do a fantastic job of weaving in stories from the Quran and stories from life and the world in like delightful ways. So
yeah,
highly recommend. And now for our main hero for this episode. Our main hero is Malala Yousafzai. And Malala was born in Mingora, Pakistan on July 12th, 1997. When the Taliban took over in 2008, Malala stopped being able to go to the girls' school in the village that her father ran. She talks about how when she was born, it was not always celebrated to have a girl, but her father had sworn to give her everything that he could, and so he ran a girls' school. She got a good education, and when she had to stop going to the girls' school, she persisted with her education with support from her father and graduated from Oxford University in 2020. And on the Malala Fund website, she says, "I tell my story not because it is unique, but because it is the story of many girls," which I think resonates really well with what we were talking about with Lamia and with the stories of Asiya and Esther and even Kamala Khan, right? It is because there are those touch points, because there are those points of resonance with other lived experiences, that the stories take on a whole new meaning and new life. And Malala in particular is most well known for speaking out on behalf of the right of girls to learn. And in October of 2012, a masked gunman shot her on the left side of her head because of her activism and because she was so outspoken, and it took years for her to recover, but she actually was able to recover, and as we said, graduate from Oxford University.
My goodness.
Yeah.
I don't think I've actually met someone who went to Oxford.
Nor have I. And it's not just like went to Oxford, but in 2018 she began studying philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Oxford, and then graduated in 2020. Right, so like into...
Wow.
Yeah. I was like, what? Amazing. She became the youngest Nobel laureate when she received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014 for her work with the Malala Fund, which its purpose is to give every girl an opportunity to achieve a future she chooses. And we'll link to the website for the Malala Fund in the episode description. And it gives a really good kind of bio of who she is, but then also talks about why girls' education is important and the work that they're doing around the country. Yeah, so that is the very basics of Malala's story. She is certainly a hero.
Absolutely.
In our world. One of the things that I love about Malala is that space that I think Esther and Asia also hold of, like, a life being threatened and a persistence for what is right. That her whole life she knew it was important to get an education. Her father instilled it in her and specifically taught her and ran a school to teach her. And so when others came in and said that she couldn't, she already knew. And so she was able to have that strength and that support to persist in pursuing education for herself and for all the other girls in her community.
I grew up being told again and again that we stand on the shoulders of the people who went before us and fought to create the rights and privileges that we have. And Malala is a reminder that sometimes we will be asked to be that someone for someone else in the future. In real life, not just in comics.
Yeah. I also appreciate that space where she says, I tell my story not because it is unique, but because it is the story of many girls. And that reminder that when we think about and talk about heroes, yes, Malala's story and Malala as a person has been particularly highlighted and lifted up, but she didn't do it alone. She had family support and stuff, but also she's not the only girl trying to get an education in a community where it's discouraged. And so I think that is something that Esther is not the only one, right? She had Mordecai and the whole community of faith. Asia, not the only one. When she connected to Musa or Moses, it opened up opportunities. Kamala Khan is not the only one. She has friends who are helping her and supporting her. She has a faith community. She has family. I love that pushback against the, heroes as lone heroes.
Exactly. I think there's a whole bit in one of her comics about how, because we all have lives and families and other responsibilities, that's why the heroes of the greater New York, New Jersey area have a shared Google Calendar of who's available to be a hero that day. And I loved that because at one point, I think she has to go to her sister's birthday party or something, and so she's worried about not being able to help with a thing, and one of the other heroes from the area comes in and says, no, this is why we have the shared Google Calendar. You are on that, right? It was fabulous.
And she's like, oh, that's awesome.
They figured that out eventually.
Yeah. At first, I thought you were talking about a real life one, and I was like, that's so cool! And I was like, no, you don't mean real life. You mean Ms. Marvel, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the tie-ins to today's themes, we've already talked about some, but that taking a risk for education and also embracing faith as part of that work and part of her life and an important part of her life and work, and recognizing when others are using faith to harm, which I think is very brave and can be scary. And we as Christians are not always great at that. It is a very important part of what we do to name that for folks and make sure that they are not taking it away from us, that we are not letting them have the particular label and perspective all on their own, but are challenging that.
Yeah.
The two main media ways to learn more about Malala, there's a kids board book series called Ordinary People Change the World. And so they have a board book that is I Am Malala Yousafzai. It does have a picture of a gun on it. So if you are reading it with a kid, just know that happens, and you can either skip over that page if needed or know that you'll need to be prepared to talk about it. And then also the book I Am Malala, which is her autobiography, and there's also a young reader's edition to that. So you can get basically any age. There's a way to learn about her that is age appropriate.
Very appropriate.
Yeah. Other themes that all of these tie in with, in addition to young people being in dangerous situations, saving lives, are the connection to their faith community, the connection specifically to Islam for Kamala Khan and for Malala, and the challenge to and from their faith community. Kamala Khan's faith community pushes back when they don't know who this Ms. Marvel Nightlight character is because they know that they're going to be under the microscope from the government. And the Taliban reinterpreted the Quran in a way that was harmful, and all of the different ways that we can twist and turn faith, and yet the persistence of, no, my faith calls me to do this, calls me to push against this, to push for education or safety or whatever it may be.
And I also noticed there's a consistent theme of the effects of colonization or imperialism, as well as immigration in all of these stories. Kamala is Pakistani American, and there's plenty of colonization and imperialism in that history. Esther and Mordecai are descended from people who were taken in the Babylonian exile. Asya, I believe it's hinted in at least a couple of places I read that she might not have been Egyptian herself. She was from somewhere else. I might need to be corrected on that.
Even if not, like the colonization part of being married to the Pharaoh.
Of Pharaoh and the Israelites and all of that. And then, of course, Malala and the very complicated history of all the different countries that have been involved in the area and the fight against the Taliban, and then her escape to Oxford. So, yeah, all of those characters and people have had to deal with crossing a lot of different boundaries and nations.
Yeah. And then also, of course, family involvement and support, which is not something that we usually see in superhero stories a whole lot, but this Ms. Marvel has family support and has a community that is supporting her as they find out about who she is. And certainly Malala did, certainly Esther did, and Asya does more of a creating family and support. Certainly in Lamia's reimagining of her ending, finally gets that family and that support that she deserves, because we all deserve it.
Absolutely. And now it's time for our Muppets moment. So, which Muppet would you cast for one or more of the heroes of this episode?
I don't know how familiar you are with the Muppets, Lamia, but we have a very broad definition of Muppets. So if you're not familiar with Muppets, cartoons, puppets, Pokemon, they all count. But when we think about Esther, Asya, Kamala Khan / Ms. Marvel, the question of the day is, which Muppet would you cast for one or more of the heroes in this episode?
So I thought about this a lot, and I think that Asya would be Snuffleupagus.
Oh.
Yeah, because Snuffy is like, I don't know, it just like exudes warmth and like kindness and just like a giant hug, but also flits in and out of visibility, which I thought was really interesting, because I think that's a thing that happens to Asya, like both in the Quran, you know, where she's not named, but also I think just like being in this, you know, abusive situation, I think she tends to like go in and out of our collective consciousness. But what I really like about Snuffy is that at the end, everyone believes him, like everyone believes that he's real. And so he does get, like, in some ways, he gets a reimagined ending. So yeah, that was mine.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
It is.
That is such a brilliant, I love that cast. What about you, Kay?
Well, honestly, I have trouble casting any of these heroes as Muppets, because aside from Kamala Khan, I don't want a Muppet to go through what these women went through. Because no one should have to.
True.
I guess if I'm going to cast Kamala Khan, goodness, I was sort of having the image of Elmo, because while Kamala, she's not quite as warm and fuzzy as Elmo is, but at the start she really doesn't know what she's doing, and that is always the role that Elmo is cast in, and she's trying to figure things out, and she's trying to ask questions, and the general confusion that Elmo so often winds up in is exactly where she is. And so I think I would cast her. But if I was going to cast a character other than our main heroes, I have to say the idea of Statler and Waldorf splitting the role of Mordecai and constantly making fun of everyone, it sounds exactly like what Mordecai would do, and that would be so much fun. I don't know if that means that, like, Mordecai has a brother Mordecai, or is Mordecai just have two heads and we don't talk about it, or what. But I think that would be very fun.
I love it.
Emily?
I was thinking about this, and I think that for Esther, I'm thinking about Lamia's comment of a genderqueer Esther. And I think Gonzo is great at that. I also have Gonzo as, like, the servant to the king that's like besties with Esther, that like is the storyteller. That's like,
yes.
And then this happened, and then this happened, right? I think Gonzo could be great at that as well.
Well, and Rizzo would have to be with him if he's going to be telling a story, like in A Christmas Carol.
Right. And I think that would make sense. Yeah. And if that were the case, then I would probably actually put Scooter as Esther, because she is very thoughtful and intentional, and she like thinks through. She has a whole plan of how she does it before she puts it into action, and that seems very Scooter to me.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm now struck by the question of what if we added to the Muppets moment, and which astrological sign would each of these heroes be? But man, that would be a whole different level of work.
Yeah, that we would need like
days.
Emily Garcia or Susanna to be like special guests for that, because every
episode would be 6 hours long.
Yeah. I would not be that good at it. Yeah.
Yep.
So, Lamia, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
I've been really inspired by my friend who has this policy of talking about Palestine every time that she is asked to talk about something. Mm-hmm. And what's been on my mind recently is the massacre in the Nusayba refugee camp, where humanitarian aid workers, where essentially like the Israeli and U.S. military came into the area disguised as humanitarian aid workers and killed a lot of people to free 4 hostages. I think the number is in the like 200s of Palestinians who were killed. And I've just been thinking about that a lot and just feeling a lot of like deep anger and sadness that this is happening in the world right now.
Yeah. I had not heard the part that they dressed up as aid and relief workers to come in, but what is the value of life when 4 people and 200 people, and just the imbalance. And the anger of sort of, a population that is being starved right now. And they actually came in through the pier that was built, the humanitarian aid pier, which has now been disassembled now that this sort of like operation is over. And just I like that dressing, I think disguising yourself as, I think that's like a level of vile that I just like can't even imagine, especially to a population that is being starved of resources, of food, and is being, essentially bombed out of existence. Yep. Yeah. There's a scene in the Hunger Games where they pretend like these parachutes are aid because that's what they've always been in the games, and then they explode. And thank you so much, Lamia 8, for joining us, and thank you, dear listeners, for joining us. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, Muppets music was by Brenda Boss, and seasonal artwork was by Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into villains. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it's much cheaper than going through the American immigration process. Of course, most things are.
It's true. Also, let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter which Muppet you would cast as one of today's heroes.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.